we had discussed Luke chapter 1. Now, as we mentioned, it's kind of almost a double chapter, and there is so much in it, in the amount of details of the two births, the prediction and carry through of John's birth and the things which he would do in the way that God had especially prepared him, and in the ways that God would send him in a way that would get everyone's attention, that there is a prophet of God among them, and he would be that great voice crying in the wilderness, of which Malachi and Isaiah had spoke. Then, and we also, coming in a completely different way, not coming with announcement in the temple to a priest, but coming to an obscure young woman in an obscure village, and coming quite quietly. Another angelic announcement, both again by Gabriel, that Mary would have a child, and she would have one as a virgin, and that she praised God, said, "I am your servant, may it be done to me by your word." And then she went to visit Elizabeth, who was 6 months farther along, and as we mentioned, probably the most likely home in the country to give her a sympathetic reception, because you think about the reception of unwed mothers, how sympathetic is reception do they often get? And think in this culture and time. So as we made the point, as where Elizabeth and Zechariah, everybody who saw what God was doing and heard of the things with John, they would bless them and congratulate them. There would be almost the opposite reaction toward Mary. But we also made mention that Mary showed more faith in reception of the message in its first telling than did the aged priest. And so he suffered muteness for a time until he showed that he had great belief in this and did as the angel instructed by naming the child John. And then he gave as well prophecy, very much like the Psalms. So Mary and Zechariah, they both give inspired messages. So we have the first inspired messages, as we mentioned, from person to person in 350 years as the gospel is being prepared. And everybody, as we mentioned, was who knew about these things would say, like verse 66, "What then will this child become?" So there's something going on. And so the seeds of the gospel are being planted, and 3 decades from now, when John and Jesus begin their public ministry, there will be people who remembered these things. There would be recollection that, this is what maybe has come from those great events so many years ago. Steve, did you have, and you mentioned after class, an observation or comment about particularly regarding the things with Zechariah? As it often does.
So Matt came up to me after class on Wednesday last week. He asked me if there was some more that I wanted to say about this. And I got to thinking about it more and more, is that in a situation with Zacharias, he's told by Gabriel that he and his wife are going to have a child when they're both well past that age of childbearing. And Zacharias, even for a brief moment, was unglorified, or it's not going to come back in a doubting manner to God.
Right.
And Zacharias paid a price for that moment where he questioned what would be done. I don't know if I wanted to say that he doubted what was being said, but certainly he questioned.
He did.
How is this going to happen? Show me a sign. But you look at the example of when Sarah was told she was going to have a child, and she laughed to herself.
Right.
Why? How is it that these people suffer minutely compared to what Lot's wife did?
Right. But in Sarah's case, she was just given a very mild verbal rebuke, and then it's never brought up again. It is interesting, because what if Sarah would have been struck mute for 9 months? Would that have been acceptable? We think, well, God would have been okay. That would have been just, wouldn't it? And that's what I want to point out. If you just look at the first words, and I think it must be something of attitude behind it. What does Zechariah, what does he say? His first words are, and we read verse 18. He says, how, in this translation, how can I know this? And what does Mary say? And Mary speaks in verse 34, how can this be? Zechariah says, how can I know? Because I'm old and my wife is well advanced in years. And Mary said, how can this be? Because, well, I've never had relations. There doesn't seem to be on the, if you just put those those two answers side by side, I don't see a lot in the words themselves. I think there must have been something in the attitude. But I think about all the times when my children have gotten in trouble with not just how they responded to the instruction of Dad, but what? Tone of voice, how you said it. I think there must be something quite revealing there that the words themselves maybe don't convey.
You're probably right, but I'd also point out that if Mary had been struck dumb for 9 months, then you have an unwed, probably a teenager girl who's pregnant.
And has no defense.
To explain it.
Right.
I mean, likely illiterate as well. Maybe not, but it wouldn't be uncommon for women of that station of her social class to be illiterate. And so she'd just be completely defenseless to accusations.
That's true.
She had a hard enough time already, so.
That's quite true.
Take the mindset, I think it does go back to attitude, but I think it reveals the character of Mary. Zacharias was a married man, so the probability of having a child, all the tools were in place,
That's true.
but for whatever reason they didn't with Mary, that was not going to happen, period.
Right.
She was not married, and she understood that, her being a faithful child of God, she was not going to commit some sin in order to have a child. And so I think her mind was so focused, maybe some Christians might have today, well, I can't do that, that's just wrong, there's no other way around it, it's wrong. But when an angel says to you, this is going to happen, I think, again, this is just my speculation because I've never met an angel. They can see a lot more about us than what we can reveal ourselves. And, the applicable reprimand is something that's not exactly spelled out for us because it's not something that happens to us today. So I think he
Right.
hard.
I also do think, as Matt points out, it was certainly gracious of the Lord to give a very good explanation, one that we rely on, we rely on the explanation the angel gave her. So I'm kind of glad she asked this question. How can I, a virgin, have a child? The Holy Spirit will come, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. The Holy One that is born will be called the Son of God. And so if she had not asked that question, we might not, that is a wonderful, and isn't that the best explanation we have of the virgin birth? And so her question, which again I don't think ask one of doubt, but more one of methods. How will God do this? And it is explained how God will do this, and saying that nothing is impossible with God. And her reply is, I am the Lord's servant. I will let him do with me. Let me be the whatever he wishes to do with me in my life. Let it be by your word, so by his will. And so the whole thing just has a different spirit to it than how the angel answers back to Zacharias. I'm Gabriel who stands before God, and I brought you personally a message, buddy. He doesn't say buddy, but it's clearly implied. And so you'll be silent and unable to speak because you didn't believe my words. And so we definitely know he didn't believe. We know his was a question of unbelief. Hers, which is a very similar question, doesn't seem to get the response of a question of unbelief, but a question of searching. And so sometimes the things can sound an awful lot alike and not be near as like maybe as we think. And so with us, since we don't know the hearts, probably we should mostly presume it's good in the question, not automatically unbelief, because we don't know. As the angel can tell the heart, we cannot. So, yeah, there is something here. And again, we think about how much more in the coming months, how much more she has at stake in this, it seems, than Zacharias and Elizabeth. Because they've got each other. They're going to have community support. What if you found out that the old fella and his wife, everybody in town probably respects because they're good, righteous people. If you find out they're pregnant, what's the reaction? All right. I made a new friend just this last few days, and we had some time to sit and talk together. And I was telling him about some of the things with the family, and I asked him. He strongly believes. He's a member of a denominational church north side of town, of Wichita. And I asked him I said, do you have any children? Because he'd been talking about his family and his dad. I said, do you have any children? He said, no. He said, if we do, it'd be one. He said, it'd be definitely one untimely born. He said, I'm 38 and my wife's 44. And so they're not expecting children at all. And I just wonder, 25 years from now, if he finally has a child with her, how many people would be so happy for them, right? All right, man, congratulations. And everybody who hears about this about Elizabeth and Zachariah, it's just going to be, the more you hear about it, the happier you are. And with Mary, when it's an unwed pregnancy, the more you hear about it, usually what happens? And if you hear, did you hear she's saying that God did it? Have you heard those rumors? Come on, right? Who's going to believe that? And outside the immediate family, who would believe that? And so what happens? No, the gospel? There'll be a lot of gossip, right? But when would anybody start to believe this story of Mary outside the family?
Verse later on it said he was assumed to be the son of Joseph.
Right. So for a lot of people who don't know the story, but what happens when the angelic chorus shows up the night of the birth? Oh, that starts to did you hear? The shepherds came and said angels are singing out on the hillsides about this kid being born.
But that wasn't our hometown, so
That's also true. Yeah,
wouldn't silence the gossip.
that's true. It's true. I wonder if that story made it back to the hometown. Anyway, all right. So we think about the mercies of God. Somebody mentioned a while ago Lot's wife. How many of us have done something that would be probably equal in our neglect of instruction, equal in our thoughts of the world as turning back to see our old hometown? And if we just walked around town or drove down the streets and we saw a number of pillars of salt, every so often on the sidewalk or in the church parking lot or down by the courthouse square, how many of us would say, well, that's unjust? Well, they'd all be. If God turns some pillars of salt, that's just, right? But he doesn't. And if we had a bunch of people, a bunch of old guys in the ministry who couldn't talk anymore, would that be just?
Sure.
That'd be very just, right? But did either of those happen regularly? No. And so we think about God's mercy. He shows these examples of what could and what would rightly be a consequence or a punishment or a judgment. Pick your verb there. And most of us don't face that, do we? But how many of us would deserve it if one of those did befall us? So God's mercy, God's kindness, God's provision, and these things which are setting up the gospel to come and be known and be received. And I got to ask you, I mean, we believe a pretty incredible story, don't we? We believe an incredible story of a virgin having a child by God. We believe that he lived without sin. We believe he died on our behalf, and we believe he conquered death and rose of his own power from the grave. That's a pretty incredible story, isn't it? And if that incredible story happened, wouldn't there be some pretty incredible things around it? I think there would be, right? There'd be some pretty out-of-the-ordinary events that had to go with those things. And what does this establish? A credible telling of incredible events. Because when you read about these incredible things from Luke, do you get the feeling that these things really happened? I sure get that feeling, don't you? Doesn't this read like a better history than any other history you've ever read? And I've read a lot of history books. And this reads like a history of real things, but really incredible things at the same time.
I think it gets back to that adage you see sometimes today. You've heard it where it says, God says it, I believe it, that settles it.
Right.
But that's immature.
The middle part of that.
That settles it. It's whether I choose to believe or not doesn't really
That's right.
matter into it. It's what he says, do I glorify God, knowing it, and have faith that this is what's going to happen.
That's right. I spent my latter middle school and early junior high years hearing a preacher make that point and say it repeatedly, like once every 6 weeks for several years. He would say, people say God said it, that I believe it, that settles it. He said, whether you believe it has nothing to do with it, it's already settled, then you can conform with it or not. And so, yeah, this is settled history. And yes, we should believe it, and it should be settled in our mind, right? It should be settled in our hearts. But it is settled whether we unite it with faith in our hearts or not. So we have this, again, credible telling of incredible events. Okay. With that, have we gone back? Anybody want to, again, we got 80 verses. I know there's many truths to glean and to expand on in chapter 1. Is there any that anybody wishes to bring up, or shall we move on for chapter 2? All right. So we only have 52 verses in chapter 2, but we've got the birth of Christ. We've got angels and shepherds. We've got Jesus in the temple. We've got more public prophecy. We've got Jesus in the temple in the one and only story of his youth. And so we still have quite a bit in chapter 2 to look at, and we might be here a little bit. So in chapter 2, if we start looking at our guide, our outline of the 52 verses, we've divided this for this study to 5 paragraphs. The birth of Jesus Christ. It is in the time of Caesar Augustus, and there are others in time things that Luke gives as well. But I remember when I was in my Western Civ classes in history back at the university, Caesar Augustus was the guy we mentioned. He's kind of an important person, isn't he? He's a real person. And this is, so again, real history in real time. And so Joseph goes to his ancestral home to be counted for the census. So the Jews did everything by family and by lineage. So even though he lived in Nazareth, and who knows how long his branch of the family had lived up there, we know that they were, the ancestral homeland is he was a descendant of David. The ancestral city was Bethlehem, just 6 or 7 miles from Jerusalem, and he went there for the counting of the census. Mary gives birth to her firstborn son, as it says there in verse 7. at that time. And we know because the city was packed full of people, there was no room for them in what we traditionally have the wording the inn, which probably is not the best word, because was it the Holiday Inn or the La Quinta, which was overbooked? The Village. There you go. It was the Village Inn. That's the one that was overbooked. And so the child is born there basically among the livestock. In the ancient homes, and the homes would be gathered all together. It's not like where people lived out on farmsteads, all scattered about the countryside. For protection in the ancient cities, the people clustered together tightly in villages, and then they went out to the fields that would surround the city. And it's a bit of a discussion as to how ancient Bethlehem would have been constructed. Would it have been the first floor, would have been the animals, and the family lived on the second floor? And so the family house would have been full upstairs, and so they go downstairs to where the animals are, which is kind of the equivalent of, has your house ever been so full that somebody had to sleep in the garage? It's about that kind of equivalent. And the other would be, they would have small houses, and then attached through courtyards, there would be outbuildings, but again, buildings that are not very far. Think about, like, again, a detached garage. Was the livestock in a small building really close to the house, like a detached garage? In any case, whether it was right beside across a courtyard, or whether it was stacked, the places where the animals were kept and the places where the humans lived were really close together. The houses are all full of all these families that have come in. And basically, again, the best equivalent to this is, today, overflowing into the garage. Because we don't keep livestock, well, except for a couple of you guys here. Most of us just keep cars. But anyway, it's then in the middle of the night come the shepherds into town. And I love Christmas music and Christmas carols. Y'all know that. I also do like to recognize when they are mistaken in their theology or in their factuality. And the one thing about the hymn or the carol, Silent Night, when those shepherds got to town and started looking through people's buildings where the livestock was kept looking for a baby, you think it stayed silent very long? Or would that rouse everybody? What would happen if there was a group of people today just started going down the alley and poking in people's backyards and poking in people's garages, looking to see where a baby was born? You think people would know? That'd wake people up and get people, kind of stirred up. And I think so. So I don't think it was a silent night. I don't think that at all. So
The postcard showed a star shining down on the neighbors.
well, probably that 8 or 12 inches of brand new, fresh, unfootprinted snow kind of kept the noise down, kind of muffled it all.
So the traditional site has the Church of Nativity there, and it's actually has I think the manger scene is actually in a cave.
In a cave?
Is where they believe.
Okay.
And
they believe that they picked that site out a long, long time ago.
Yeah, in the 3rd century, and that was all the locals were saying that's the place. It may not have been, but I mean it's
Right.
So they would keep when I say cave, not like a tunnel, but like
An outcrop.
Like a depression into the rock.
Into the sidewall of a hill.
Right.
Type thing.
That'd probably be a better way of
Yeah. The two sites. There's two ancient sites. Well, three. There's three ancient sites that are very, very likely to be the actual sites of things. The Church of the Nativity. For one reason is the Church of the Nativity. I have read that it is about 80% the size of the village in Jesus' time. So that church is so large, it just basically covers everywhere the village was, because the village footprint was so small. So somewhere at the Church of the Nativity, certainly Jesus was born, because the modern church complex just kind of covers the whole area. But there is a place in a kind of a depression, a cave-like, a deep depression in the sidewall of a hill, where people have identified since the late 200s?
Constantine's mother went through and they talked to locals, and the locals said that's the place that the past generation we've been saying is.
Right, and so that was about 200 years after the fact. So again, it's a small town. There wouldn't have been that many sites. So that one is one of the ones you are really close. The other is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That at the same time they identified the place where the cave where Jesus was buried and used as a tomb. And again, if they were anywhere in that area, that church is so large it kind of covers the several possible. So that is also very close. And if it's not there, it's within 100 or 2 yards. The other one is there's a site on the Jordan River where they say John baptized. And it was also identified very early on. It's a very logical place. And John went all up and down the river. So he probably was at that place too, but not exclusively. So if you do a Holy Land tour, if you're at those 3 sites and the actual site is important for you to stand on, you can be rest assured you're within a baseball's throw of the places at those 3. The rest of them, who knows. Okay, so the shepherds came in with that, bringing that good news of great joy, which the angelic choir had announced. Then in verse 22 through 38, Jesus is circumcised, and then he's taken to the temple for the rites of redemption, the redemption of the firstborn. So all the firstborn, there was a special price paid to God, saying that the firstborn belongs to God, and you're basically paying the price of the firstborn that it's yours, but that person's dedicated to God. Well, back when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, there was a special tax, a price for all the firstborn, because they're all dedicated to God. And the only ones who were exempt from that were the tribe of Levi, because in that tribe, everyone was dedicated to God, and there was no redemption from that service. So they did those sacrifices. And in the temple at that time is Simeon and Anna. So these 2 saints of whom we know little, except the few words spoken about them by Luke. Luke attests to their character. Luke attests to their faith and their real expectant waiting to see the Messiah. And they see Jesus, and they pronounce both blessings and prophecies at the sight of the young child, and talks about how Mary and Joseph were amazed, and these are the things that she treasures in her heart. It's from these events that, like I say, it's my firm personal conclusion that Luke must have sat down and spoke to Mary for a long time. I just can't imagine any other way that this is so given to us. I realize God could just reveal anything to any inspired person. But Luke saying he investigated these things and the way it's spoken, I'm just sure that Luke was able to visit at length with Mary. And then tells us that they went back to Nazareth. And so Luke does not tell us any of those things that we know from Matthew about the Magi coming, about the murder of the other innocent children in town, and about the time in Egypt. Luke just skips straight to the going to Nazareth. It's kind of like what we're studying Galatians on our Thursday night study, that Luke skips over some information that Paul tells in Galatians about 3 years of Paul's work, or 3 years of Paul's life, where he goes, after his conversion, he goes to Arabia. And Luke doesn't mention it. He just has him in Damascus, and then he picks it back up in Damascus. But from Galatians, we know he left Damascus, went to Arabia, and came back. And there's a 3-year period that Luke just says, after many days. So Luke does that same thing in Acts with Paul once. Then lastly, we have the familiar story of Jesus as a boy in the temple. And he's 12. He is separated from his family. We don't know the exact circumstances. I've heard some pretty reasonable speculation about as to how and why and the mechanics of that separation. because it happens right about the time you transition from being a child with the women and being a young man with the men. And so maybe the women thought he was with the men and the men thought he was with the women, but he was in the temple the whole time, and he was astounding the doctors and teachers of the law with his amazing understanding even at that age. And so then he returns with his parents to Nazareth, and we have another long hiatus of 25, 28-ish years before we have the next story. So Luke 2, all these events are pretty well known to us. All right, our keys in this chapter: Jesus born in Bethlehem. The angels sing praise and send the shepherds to see the child. Jesus presented at the temple, and Jesus grows in wisdom and stature. It's interesting to see these events. In one sense, they're very public, and they're things that a lot of people would remember. But at the same time, they're also in some ways kind of small events where they don't get the whole countryside involved. And so it's a sort of a, it's a limited publicity. It's putting these things out that people would remember. It's putting these things out again, which if we did have, as we mentioned, the sinless Son of God come into the world, born of a virgin, we would expect some extraordinary things. But they're also wrapped in just the very ordinary going on of life. And it's just interesting to see what's absolutely extraordinary and what's absolutely ordinary. Any particular day of the temple, how many children would have been brought by faithful families for this redemption of the firstborn ritual and paying of the tax to the temple and doing some sacrifices. I mean, that line forms here, right? And if you want to get done kind of early in the day, you'd probably have to be there early in the morning, right? Because there's a line of young families with their firstborn children, and we think about how happy these parents are, and this long line of them, and they're coming to the temple, and also the crying babies and all the things that go with that. And here's one more baby in that line doing this, which is being done every day, but we don't have people coming up and offering prophecy, do we? I mean, and can you imagine you're standing there with your firstborn, and this old man comes up and starts giving prophecy about the kid in front of you or the kid behind you? What fun is that? Or the priest or the Levites who are tending the line and keeping all the families in a good order. Like, that prophecy, what are they saying? Who are these people walking up, these strangers to these people, and introducing themselves and praying for this child and giving blessings to this family? What is that? Or did people notice? It's just kind of stunning to think about this. We study these events and think about them so much, and there probably was some people, three families away, didn't even know what's going on. And just going through the same thing. They, their older brothers and sisters had taken their kids down there, and now it's their turn. And anyway, to me, it's just absolutely striking and amazing. Yes?
One thing I think, a couple things that if you look at the passages there in John 1:1 and John 1:14, those talk about God, that the Word was with God. He was there from the beginning, wherever that beginning was. And then it said the Word became flesh. Never does it indicate in this second chapter here or any other one where it says that Mary was the mother of God.
That's true.
That God was there before Mary. That Mary did not pass any physical attributes or make God a better person. It's because God was perfect before he ever even took that form as a child. So to say that Mary is the mother of God is somewhat of a blasphemous statement.
As Catholic theology has developed around that, it has certainly elevated Mary beyond any possible place of humanity and beyond what the scriptures say. The scriptures affirm it is her son, and she is definitely called the mother of Jesus. She's called the mother of the Son of God, I think. Isn't she, Matt? I see you're racking your brain, Matt.
I'm just wondering, so, can you say that again, Steve? Sorry. Which part? Mary being the mother of God.
But you hear that being stated, that Mary, mother of God,
You don't
more
like
in the
that.
Catholic dogma. But to say that, and when we talk about Mary, she is never the mother of God, because Christ was God before Mary was ever even born. And then John 1:14 says that the Word became flesh. So she can't be the mother of something that already existed before she was ever born.
I guess, but there is a sense in which if she is the mother of Jesus,
She is the mother of Jesus. There's no denying that.
and Jesus is part of the Godhead.
That's true.
I think I understand what you're saying, and I don't really object to it. There is, but you could say there is a sense in which she is the earthly mother.
The earthly mother of an earthly child.
But you're right, she didn't contribute anything
No.
substantively important.
Right, in his divine attributes. There was nothing that would have come from Mary, because there's nothing for Mary she could possibly have given. I'm sure that Jesus, when he's in the family sketches, because they didn't have photographs, when they had the family together for the sketches, I'm sure he kind of looked like his cousins. I'm sure he looked like the family, right? I think we're all pretty confident of that he would have looked like he belongs in this family, because he wasn't in that family. And I don't know how to explain much beyond that without getting into a number of things that historically have always been condemned as heresies. It's really hard to go into explanations of these things which don't get into some kind of theological difficulty with somebody. So she is Mary's mother. He is called her son, her firstborn son. She is continually called his mother. And there are places where she even says about Joseph, she says, your father and I, like here in the end of chapter 2. But we understand that's an accommodative sense, kind of like, a stepfather would be. Especially the Catholic theology of Mary with Immaculate Conception, mediatrix, being some of the statements of Catholic theology of Mary, Mother of God, stretch way beyond gospel truth. I think we can say that. All right, well, write it down. Write it down.